Добрый день, я Сергей Aleksashenko, и вы в гостях на моем YouTube-канале. Но на сегодня с вами буду разговаривать не я. Вы знаете, что те, кто меня смотрит постоянно, или те, кто посещает мой канал достаточно регулярно, знают, что время от времени я выкладываю у себя на канале видео, выступления, интервью других людей, как правило, англоязычные выступления, англоязычные спикеры. Это связано с тем, что во время последнего стрима мы говорили о проблемах обучения, образования, и что образование никогда не заканчивается, и желание узнать что-то новое, желание узнать то, чего я не знал, ознакомиться с какими-то аспектами жизни, узнать другую точку зрения, оно заставляет, толкает меня к тому, чтобы слушать других людей. Не всегда эти подкасты или эти видеоинтервью бывают удачными, бывают неудачные, бывает то, что мне не нравится, бывает то, что меня отталкивает. Но есть те, которые мне нравятся достаточно сильно, и я считаю правильным, возможным делиться ими с вами. Одно из моих увлечений последнего времени – это история. Мне кажется, что изучение истории, анализ истории, рассматривание исторических ситуаций, оно позволяет смотреть на сегодняшний мир, на сегодняшнюю жизнь с какой-то другой точки зрения. Ведь в конечном итоге мы все люди, и человеческая природа, она достаточно неизменна, она меняется медленно. И людьми движут те же самые мотивы сегодня, что были и 30, и 50, и 1500 лет назад. Желания авторитарных лидеров те же самые, что были 2000 лет назад, 1000 лет назад, сегодня или будут через 50 лет, или через 100 лет. Мы не знаем. И поэтому рассказы на исторические темы, рассказы, анализ ситуации с учетом опыта прошлого, он всегда интересен. История никогда не дает ответа на вопрос, что будет завтра. Но история может рассказать о том, как похожие ситуации решались или рассматривались несколько лет назад, или много лет назад, или очень-очень много лет назад. И вот сегодня вашим собеседником будет американский профессор, историк Нилл Фергюссон, который работает в Стэнфордском университете, в институте Гувера. И он будет говорить о том, как нужно смотреть на можно смотреть на сегодняшнюю ситуацию. Это Третья мировая война или Холодная война 2.0. Все, что он будет говорить, не означает, что я с этим согласен, что я поддерживаю эту точку зрения, что я разделяю эту точку зрения. Но мне она была интересна, надеюсь, что этот разговор будет интересен и для вас. И последнее, наверное, самое важное, очень важное. Разговор будет идти на английском языке. Поэтому для тех, кто не владеет этим языком в достаточной степени, чтобы воспринимать на слух, нужно включить русские субтитры. Для этого вам нужно посмотреть на нижнюю строчку меню, ютубовского меню, и для начала нажать на кнопочку CC, чтобы она была беленькая, и чтобы это означает, что у вас будут включены субтитры. После этого вы смело нажимаете соседнюю кнопочку с шестеренкой, и у вас выскакивает меню, где написано Subtitles, субтитры. И дальше вы ищете опцию Auto Translate, автоперевод, который находится внизу, красная стрелочка. Дальше вы ищете русский язык, нажимаете на эту кнопочку, и вот они чудеса современной технологии. Вы получаете субтитры на русском языке. Я понимаю, что для кого-то это не очень удобно, потому что нужно сидеть у экрана и читать. Но альтернативная история, это нужно потратить 2-3 часа времени, чтобы отредактировать перевод, сделанный компьютерной системой. К сожалению, моя загрузка в последнее время не позволяет мне это делать, хотя мне когда-то очень нравилось. Поэтому, если есть желающие, хорошо владеющие английским языком и достаточно уверенно владеющие компьютером, можете мне написать, и мы попробуем организовать некое такое совместное предприятие, с какой-то периодичностью делать звуковое сопровождение таких интервью. А так, на английском языке Нилл Фергюссон, Холодная война 2.0 или Мировая война 3. Слушайте, пишите ваши отзывы, отклики, и до новых встреч. До свидания.
In this happy place, where the vibe shift feels very real, it's almost bad taste to think of a very different place. but I don't want you to do that. I want you to think about Vilnius. I want you to think about a city that was once the Jerusalem of the North, the greatest center of Jewish learning and culture in all of Europe. I would guess there are members of this audience with family roots in Lithuania. Put a hand up if you have a connection to. Okay. So, I went there for the first time just a couple of months ago. It's a pretty town. It's an attractive destination, beautiful Baroque architecture. If you didn't know the history, you wouldn't see the ghosts. Vilnius is a city of ghosts. So many people died. And they died as a result of historical forces none of them could control or anticipate. How could they foresee that the Jerusalem of the North would be for a time a Polish city and then would be taken over by Soviet Lithuania and then would be overrun by the Nazis, who set about, with considerable assistance from local Lithuanian militias, massacring all the Jews of Vilnius and nearly all the Jews of Lithuania. No country in the Holocaust suffered a higher percentage of deaths than in Lithuania. As I walked around those streets, past the vanished synagogues, I remembered why I became a historian. Why, despite the fact that I was raised an atheist and recently became, along with my wife Ayan, a Christian, I have devoted a substantial part of my scholarly career to studying the history of your people. Because the tragedy that befell the Jews is the single most horrific event of history. And what makes it so horrific is that ultimately it was perpetrated by the most advanced of European countries. The country, Germany, that had, in the 1920s, the best universities in the world, the most Nobel Prizes of any country, the most advanced industrial and technological economy in Europe. The reason I became a historian was to try to understand the central problem that the Holocaust exemplifies. That not education, not modernity, not great music, not great literature, not great science, none of these things can inoculate us against evil. And to understand, as Tolstoy put it, what is the power that moves nations? The question he asks at the end of War and Peace. That has been my life's work. I posed a question to give myself a lecture title tonight. Cold War II or World War III? And I want to try in a few brief minutes before we turn to discussion to think about our present moment using these two analogies to try to illuminate where we are. Let's begin with Cold War II. Let's begin with the time in which Vilnius was in a deep freeze. The deep freeze of Cold War. The grip of Stalin, of Soviet power, had been reimposed on Lithuania and on Vilnius with the collapse of the Wehrmacht and the defeat of Hitler's Third Reich. And from then, from 1944-45, until the dissolution of the Soviet Empire between 1989 and 1991, history in Vilnius essentially stopped. Nothing was built, improved. The city was in a deep freeze. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. I'm old enough to remember the Soviet Union. I'm old enough to remember the Stasi trailing me when I, as a student, visited East Berlin for the first time. And the question that I have asked myself repeatedly for the last 6 years is, are we in a new Cold War? Are we in Cold War II? And was that period after 1991 just an interwar period that ended at some point, perhaps as long ago as 2012, certainly sometime after 2016? Now, as I mentioned, I've devoted much of my career to Jewish history. The biography I'm still in the midst of writing of Henry Kissinger is a part of my effort to understand the modern Jewish experience. If anybody could answer the question, are we in Cold War II, it was Henry Kissinger. And so I asked him. And I had the sheer nerve, the chutzpah, to ask him in Beijing in November 2019 at a conference organized by Bloomberg. I had no idea how he would reply. After all, he was a man who had, more than any other Westerner, more than any other American, built the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It's perhaps the achievement that many people most associate with him. Are we, Dr. Kissinger, I asked, in a new Cold War? He gave one of those pregnant pauses before replying. And his reply, I'll never forget, was this. We are in the foothills of a Cold War. In the foothills of a Cold War. What an answer. It's not often that you sort of feel a shiver of historical recognition go down your spine, but I felt it then. And a year later, he, in another interview with someone else, upgraded it to the mountain passes of a Cold War. Shortly before his 100th birthday, I asked him again about that question. And he said to me, the second Cold War will be more dangerous than the first. Now, if anybody was qualified to recognize a Cold War, it was surely Henry Kissinger, who was there at the beginning of the first Cold War and there at the end of it. Two superpowers, ladies and gentlemen. One committed to capitalism and democracy, the other committed to Marxism-Leninism. Ideologically divided, in a technological competition with one another, not only in the field of nuclear weapons, but now also in the field of artificial intelligence, in the field of quantum computing. That, of course, was what Kissinger meant when he said, this is more dangerous because the technologies have become more potent, the weapons more accurate, our capacity for mass destruction even greater than it was in the First Cold War. Two superpowers in an economic competition with one another, and a closer economic competition than it ever was with the Soviet Union, whose economy was never larger than perhaps 44% of US GDP. By some measures, China overtook the United States in 2016. On a current dollar basis, not yet, but closer, certainly closer, let's say 66 or 68%, than the Soviets ever got. And this Cold War, like the First Cold War, has its geopolitical dimension. There are the flash points, the places you know are combustible, the places where the superpowers are in either direct or indirect collision. Look around the world. What do we see? War in Ukraine. Raging war, the worst war Europe has seen since 1945. How should we understand that war? Is it not somewhat similar to the way the Soviet Red Army crushed Hungarian resistance in 1956, crushed Czechoslovakian resistance in 1968, indirectly crushed Polish resistance in 1981? Or should we think of the war in Ukraine as like the Korean War, the first hot war of Cold War II, a war that divides a country in two, a war that for 1 year is extraordinarily kinetic and mobile and then becomes a war of brutal attrition until finally, out of exhaustion, an armistice is negotiated. There's a war in the Middle East, a war that you all know about, a war that officially broke out after October 7th last year, but in truth a war that had been simmering all along, a war that's now on 7 fronts by my count, a war that pits Israel not just against terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, but against Iran, against that monstrous octopus of intolerance and hate. How should we think about that conflict? Is it, by analogy with Cold War I, our 1973, 50 years ago, almost exactly to the date, 50 years before October 7th, another surprise attack on Israel? These analogies are powerful analogies, and they raise a further question. Is there another regional conflict waiting to flare up in this second Cold War? And if so, where? Think of it as, in some measure, a Cold War in mirror image. If the First Cold War was a transatlantic conflict primarily, where the great flashpoints were in the Atlantic world, but the hot wars mostly happened in Asia, Cold War II is a trans-Pacific conflict, a conflict between Washington and Beijing. And the flashpoints, the most dangerous places, are therefore in the Pacific world, Taiwan. The most dangerous island in the First Cold War was Cuba, a little island very close to the United States, which in 1962, the United States blockaded. We called it a quarantine. John F. Kennedy did, but it was in truth a blockade. And Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, had to decide, do I send a naval expeditionary force to run the blockade and risk World War III? Imagine a role reversal. Taiwan is an island off the coast of China. that China is preparing, rehearsing, the blockade of. And what will the United States do in the event of that blockade? Will our president find himself in the situation of Nikita Khrushchev, obliged to send an expeditionary force across the Pacific to run the blockade and risk World War III? If one thinks about Cold War II in that way, you rapidly arrive at the conclusion that the United States faces imminently the most dangerous moment of this Cold War. The Taiwan semiconductor crisis is likely to happen in the term of this newly elected president, because Bill Burns, the director of Central Intelligence, has more than once said that Xi Jinping has ordered his generals to be ready for war in 2027. It is also worth bearing in mind that we do not have a particularly credible strategy to deter Xi Jinping from blockading Taiwan. In fact, in all the war games of which I'm aware, the unclassified ones, the scenario of a blockade produces a very ugly outcome indeed, a large-scale war with extremely heavy casualties on both sides. In this framework, it's tempting to ask if it's time to dust down Dr. Kissinger's strategy of détente to avoid the kind of showdown that would bring us to the brink of World War III, but in the disadvantageous position of Khrushchev in 1962. Now that's the good news. The bad news is, you can see why my last book was called Doom. It's actually an ironical title. More about that later. World War III is my alternative analogy. Think about not the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Think about the 1930s. The great powers have disarmed. They thought the age of war was over and the peace dividend could be paid out indefinitely. At home, domestic opinion on both sides of the Atlantic had turned against forever wars. An isolationist mood in the United States, a pacifist mood in Europe. Meanwhile, the emergence of autocratic regimes and neo-imperial Russia under President would-be Tsar Vladimir Putin, a Marxist-Leninist China under Xi Jinping, determined to reimpose the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And then these strange bedfellows join forces. China begins to support Russia's imperial project to reimpose its power on Ukraine. Without Chinese economic assistance, the Russian war effort would not have been sustainable until today. Vast exports of Chinese dual-use equipment and now also lethal equipment have kept the Putin war machine running. An axis has formed. This was one of the unintended consequences of the foreign policy of Joe Biden. This axis has grown in the past 2.5 to 3 years. It was joined by Iran, which began to supply Putin's war machine with drones. Most recently, it's been joined by North Korea, which has sent troops to fight on Russia's side against Ukraine. When David Frum used the phrase axis of evil in 2002, he did history a disservice. There was no axis in 2002. There is an axis today. And in many ways, it's a more formidable axis than the axis of 1939-40 that united Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. What to do? what if it's not the Cuban Missile Crisis we have to worry about, but the outbreak of a world war, but in some senses has already commenced? When did World War II begin exactly? In a book called The War of the World, I tried to answer that question. The answer is not September 1939. War had already, for all intents and purposes, begun. It had already begun in China with Japan's incursions into Manchuria and beyond. It had already begun in Spain. It had already begun if you were in Czechoslovakia. The nightmare scenario for us is that World War III is already in some measure underway, and the danger exists that it can escalate as it did in 1939. If that is the case, then it seems to me the urgent imperative for the United States is to re-establish deterrence as soon as is humanly possible. All the talk of de-escalation that has characterized the last nearly 4 years has been, in truth, a self-delusion. It turns out that de-escalation is the functional opposite of deterrence. Peace through strength. George Orwell described Cold War. He defined Cold War in an astonishingly prescient essay published in 1945 as a peace that is no peace. It's a brilliant essay. He was a genius. He saw and understood as soon as he read the news of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that a new age had dawned in which nuclear-armed superpowers would be in an existence of peace that is no peace, unable to go to war because of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear Armageddon, unable to be at peace because of their mutual suspicions. I think our situation today is somewhat different. I'd characterize it as a war that is no war. The war is ongoing. It is constant. It is ongoing in cyberspace. It is ongoing in space. It is a war that ultimately will be fought in every domain with every technology that we can deploy in pursuit of strategic predominance. And you might conclude from that the outlook is very bleak. But I don't think it necessarily is. I want to conclude by telling you my reasons for optimism and why we can learn from history how to avoid both Cold War II and World War III. Our foes are very weak, in truth. Iran is weak. They have no succession plan. They turn out to have no air offensive capability and no air defense capability. The tentacles of the octopus have been lopped off. The Israeli government has achieved more in the past 3 or 4 months than anyone thought possible. Hamas is all but destroyed. Hezbollah has been decapitated and eviscerated. Israel now has the option to wage a war against Iran that could, with American support, put an end to that regime's plans to have nuclear weapons, plans that can never be fulfilled, so long as they so clearly intend to destroy the state of Israel. And we, by contrast, we have strengths. As I've been trying to understand the events of 2024, my mind keeps going back to another election that another Republican president won. And that election was that of 1980. Ronald Reagan was widely regarded as a cowboy by liberals and Europeans a B-movie star who had no business being president of the United States. The cartoons that were published at the time of Reagan's election in newspapers like The Guardian will look quite familiar to you because they so closely resemble the cartoons that those newspapers publish of Donald Trump today. Ronald Reagan ran in 1980 on some slogans that you may remember. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Peace through strength. He also used a phrase that's become familiar in these parts. Make America great again. Ronald Reagan used that phrase on the campaign trail in 1980. And what Reagan teaches us, and I think about this more and more, is that peace through strength is attainable. The old Roman adage applies. Si vis pacem, para bellum. If you wish peace, prepare for war. Ronald Reagan's arms build-up, which of course greatly disconcerted the liberals and the Europeans, was of course the motive force that began the process whereby the Soviet leadership, dismayed at their technological backwardness, embarked on reforms that ultimately were fatal to their system. Reagan's courageous challenges to the evil empire, his readiness to call on Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. My colleague at Hoover, Peter Robinson, wrote that famous line, and if I ever write one line that impactful, I'll die happy. What is extraordinary about 1980 was that he began a process that ended the First Cold War, although the end came on George H.W. Bush's watch. It was clear at the time of his election that the game was up for the Soviet system. I even wrote an op-ed that never got published with the headline, "The Berlin Wall is Crumbling," and the editor of the Daily Mail declined to publish it on the grounds that, Neil, you've been listening to too many Ronald Reagan speeches.